Do I have vlogging figured out yet? Absolutely not. Did I go to the American Writers Museum today downtown? I did. So let's take a quick field trip, John, and then meet back here and we'll chat. So this was my second extended visit to the Writers Museum. I had also gone for an author event for Saeed Jones around the release of How We Fight for Our Lives, because they actually have some really excellent programming at the Writers Museum. And at that event, I went ahead and bought a membership for a year. And then the next year was 2020. So I had not been back and unfortunately did not get the value of that membership, but also considered it a donation at that point and wasn't too worried about it because I luckily had the disposable income at the time where I didn't have to be too worried about it. And I really believe in the programming and experience and environment that the Writers Museum has set up. Now, it is a small museum. It is on the second floor of a building on Michigan Avenue. And as you may get a feel for it in some of the video clips I took, because of course I didn't take the entire museum or all of the exhibits. Most notably, I didn't capture any film of the typewriters because I didn't have a real good way to film that, and it's a very busy area, and I'm not looking to invade anyone's privacy or make them feel uncomfortable as they are enjoying their experience. But it is just undoubtedly a smaller space and a more focused vision and museum. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just talking about how they utilize that space and the exhibits that they have and what they're doing. And they also have the hurdle in this sense that it is a museum, but they are dealing with written language and written text, obviously. And that can sometimes be very hard because as an audience museum goer, it can be hard to really sit and want to read tons and tons of text, even if you are a reader. So it's about how that information is being portrayed, and then also kind of what story are we telling about America and American writers, and what kind of story are we telling about our literary identity as a culture and a country through these exhibits and the story that is being told through these exhibits, because museums and their curation and their design and everything about them is storytelling as well. So what story are we telling? And it can be hard because it feels like it's not as intuitively centralized as something like maybe an art museum, where you're going, in theory, you have either, wings of different time periods or schools of art. So when you enter the space, the first thing is there are tons of books above, and I think there was clearly thought put into those books. I think they're organized by color, but they also kind of feel like what you might encounter rummaging through a library sale and what is being weeded out just from the sense of their age. But I also think that they are a great kind of immediate welcome into the space, and they're setting the tone. It is both rooted in a history and the culture of reading, but also kind of fun and aesthetic. And then as you move in, there is a children's wing that is right to the left. And I say children's wing room, I believe there are some interactive elements for children. I didn't spend a whole lot of time in that room this time because, one, it looked like there was a meeting of some sort when I wandered in, and I just didn't remember it being as interactive as I wanted, or it wasn't necessarily where I wanted to spend my time today. But it is very nostalgic, and there's like a tree that has a bunch of children's book characters. And even if you're not necessarily going into the museum with children or being rooted in that kind of early childhood kind of mindset, I think it is smart to place that there, because most of us get our start with children's literature. And it's kind of allowing us to look at our personal history as readers and kind of the nostalgia there before we move into kind of the history of the country in terms of reading and writing and thinking about words and the way those words shape us and shape our country and our identity. So as we leave that room and before we enter kind of the main stretch of the historical portion, there is a map or kind of outline of a map of the United States that has a lot of projection onto it in terms of very popular kind of works that are rooted in our history. And it's not just books, which I really appreciate. And this continues on throughout the exhibits. There is a lot of thought and intent behind who is being featured and a wide variety of experience and voices that I often didn't know about, but were so central to their time, so central to the shaping of the landscape and our cultural landscape, and that represent a wide variety of voices. And so there is diversity throughout who is being featured here, whether it be in identity, in form, in content. You've got kind of the history on one side with a timeline featuring different authors chronologically and kind of looking at the kind of progression of the American voice. And then on the other wall, you have pieces of these very prominent voices. As you saw in the video, there is a piece from Kindred, not featured on the video, but two squares that I have been drawn to both visits are for Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman of the Wallpaper fame, and for Our Town by Thornton Wilder, which is a play and is part of the American canon of playwriting and theater. So in this space, you've got a lot of the big names you expect to see there, right? You've got Edgar Allan Poe, you've got Emily Dickinson, you've got Edith Wharton, you've got Frederick Douglass, you've got Harriet Beecher Stowe, you've got a lot of the big names. And then you have a lot of other writers that were very influential at their time and maybe haven't stayed in the consciousness to the same level as some of these other names, but are so important to the moment that they were in, and also have in their way shaped the moment we are in because of that. And so I really do love this room and how it's set up, because it is a lot of information and it can be kind of overwhelming. I admittedly, when I enter it, don't hit up every person in the timeline and read through everything, but one, they have made it as interactive as they can. In terms of the timeline, they have this feature on all of these people, and then they have a kind of like periactos, although, not a huge set piece, for each person that has, like their biography, and then a couple more notable pieces about them and their work. In terms of Emily Dickinson, it is a poem on one side. And then below everything, they also have like pop-out features. There's like a whole thing about Poe and all the different genres Poe influenced. It's like, oops, all Poe. And above everything, they have the timeline that gives you kind of the wider context of the world and space all of these authors were operating within. And then below it may give you more kind of breakout contexts in terms of major literary movements at the time. For instance, there is a little bit more about transcendentalism. Don't even get me started on transcendentalism. I had to write a transcendentalism paper in 11th grade. If you also had to write about transcendentalism in high school, let me know, because that felt very specific. But the point is, there is interaction involved, as much text as there is, and the text can be overwhelming. I'm not going to downplay that, because anytime you're kind of hit with a wall of text, it can be overwhelming. But they are working to make it as interactive and engaging as possible, and as visually appealing as possible, and breaking it up visually so that you're not just standing there reading, but you are interacting with the material, especially with the opposite wall, where they have all of those kind of shadow boxes of sorts, and you're just kind of flipping them around for more information. It feels very simple, but it is a way to make it a little bit more interactive. And I think this part especially, I think the whole museum really is prime real estate for school tours, because it makes so much of this interactive and accessible. And this is kind of like the densest section of it, because it is the historical section. And for, like nerds that have their favorite authors that like want to read about what it says or learn about new authors, it's engaging for that as well. But it also situates, like I said, everything in a little bit larger context. It's also kind of shaping that story of our literary identity. But what I really appreciate is that it is showing how complicated that story is, how many different diverse and dissenting voices we have, all of the kind of like breakaway movements and differing schools of thought. And it shows us kind of the full spectrum of what we're dealing with, and I think makes history a little bit more accessible in that way. One, in terms of placing it within its context and giving it a little bit wider sense of reference, but also kind of showing that these were independent thinkers and they were pushing back against ideas, thinking through things, fighting against larger pictures or not. And then all of this plays out in the written word, and how does that shape us? And so at the end of this room is one of my favorite things in the museum, which is the word waterfall. And it goes through like different images and quotes, and it's just gorgeous. And there are some like chair beanbaggy type things there where you can sit and watch it, but it's just really visually stunning. And like the map that we're kind of greeted with as we're entering the room, it makes the words come alive. It makes the history come alive and makes it a little bit more dynamic. This in particular, this display is still really focusing on words. It's also showing how those words can paint pictures and can shape national images and national imagery. So I really enjoy that. I think it's really pretty and engaging. And we just love a good aesthetic sometimes, right? So then this moves us into the reading room. And there are some chairs in there if you want to sit and read. There are a few kind of classics scattered amongst shelves. I don't know how many people sit and read those things. I was tempted to sit and read my copy of Amari and the Great Game, but I could not like settle, especially because there was a tour going on, or like a school group, I think, an older group, but still not just like me wandering around by myself on a random weekday. But this reader's room is really focused on how readers have interacted with written text through the ages. So one side is kind of like a history of popular books. It gives kind of timelines. It just like gives like highlights, but it talks about like dime novels to paperbacks. I think it's very easy to forget that paperbacks have not been around in their current form for as long as it feels like they should have been around, and how quickly they rose to prominence, which is also a thought that I have a lot about why we haven't really progressed that further, like outside of ebooks. But You know, like, why aren't we publishing the paperback first like they do? Other conversation. But it also goes into the history of things like Book of the Month and how long Book of the Month has been around. It talks about things like the Junior Literary Guild, which you may now know as the Junior Library Guild. And I really like exploring kind of that history and how readers have interacted with books and media differently throughout the ages. It also has a feature where you can design a bookmark with your top 3 books by American authors. There's a little display where you can hang bookmarks with books that you recommend and love, which I find interesting because the bookmark, like the official one that's through the computer, it tracks favorite authors. And that list skews very heavily in favor of the classics. But if you go over to the bookmarks where people have written their own recommendations, one, you do have to kind of filter out when people put things like The Odyssey or Pride and Prejudice. But I've noticed that those lists usually are much more diverse and much more current titles than the bookmark one. And as someone who has completed the written bookmark, but not the computer bookmark, it may just be a matter of committing. And as you're moving out of the reader's room, you are greeted by the typewriters, which I think is one of the biggest draws of the museum, especially for teenagers, I would say, in school groups. When I was at the museum for that Saeed Jones reading, there was a school group finishing up a tour, and those teens were fascinated by the typewriters. And there was someone from the museum with them kind of talking about the differences in the typewriters and the history of typewriters, and it was really engaging. They were very engaged with that, and there is something to be said for that because it is tactile. And I'm not gonna lie, I sat down to get on a typewriter. When I was a kid, we had an old typewriter in the garage, and I loved playing on it, even though I couldn't do it much because the ink was almost gone and we were not going to be getting more ink for that typewriter. And I will say that was one of the drawbacks in terms of the typewriters today. I think I got on an Underwood first because it is compact. It's like the classic one of, I mean, they're all classic typewriters, but like when you think a typewriter and you think like the circular keys, like I was like, I want to play on this typewriter, but the ink wasn't super strong. I also tried to get on a Smith Corona and the ink was low. And then there was one typewriter, I can't remember what brand it was, that I admittedly couldn't figure out how to feed. I wasn't sure how to get the paper to feed through, and I thought I knew how to work the typewriter. But I would love to bring my mom here because she loved telling me stories about typewriters and how they use typewriters in school. I mean, she used a typewriter up through college, obviously, but I think it would be great to just personally, one, know how many of those typewriters she has a personal history with or has used, and two, to just kind of hear that history again. I think that there is a lot of nostalgia for the experience of typewriters, and I think they are super fun. I can't imagine having had to use them for school because the patience it would have taken would have been mind-boggling. And I think that's one thing that is very evident when you are typing on them is how it forces you to slow down. And I think being able to experience that in the museum setting and get a feel for it, especially as there are less and less typewriters that teens are probably encountering out in the wild. Like their parents probably don't have a typewriter sitting out in the garage unless it's like a family heirloom or they're really into typewriters. So I think that that piece is just a great connection to the past. Around this area too, I think, or maybe it's further up, I'm geographically challenged, but trust that this exists. I think the last time I was there, it was a Bob Dylan exhibit. Right now it is an exhibit called Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice, and go to this exhibit because it has a feature on a bunch of different writers and writers of all kinds, again, essayists, novelists, musicians, but they all have these giant portraits, which I assume were commissioned, and they are gorgeous. A couple of them are on cloth and are like quilted. They are just stunning. It is amazing artwork on top of featuring these voices. And then across from them, there is a kind of timeline divided into different sections that really focus on different major periods of justice writing and feature different works and are very moving. And I think that the selections made there and the pieces pulled out for feature were very smart. I will say next to the portraits, there was something that indicated that there was some kind of AI component if you like scanned the QR code and then looked at the portrait through your phone. I couldn't get it to work, but I was compelled by the idea because it indicated another level of kind of interaction and another way to engage with the material. So they're obviously thinking about innovative ways to make these words and worlds and these histories and these people come to life, and also to work within their smaller physical space. So then after you leave like the special exhibit and the reader's room, obviously the typewriters are kind of a segue into the more practical or the craft of the thing. And then the next room is a little bit more craft focus. So we're looking more at structure. And I think the highlight here, especially if you're looking at going with a school tour, is that there are multiple like tables, interactive tabletop things. And here you can interact more. So the first one, you're kind of looking at different notable works and there are histories and pullouts. But here you're looking a little bit more in depth at the work itself, rather than the creator and where it's sitting historically. You're still looking at that, but it really is taking a look at the craft of the piece as well. And I do appreciate that because that's one thing I think I would have liked to see more, is digging into texts in more depth in some way. I don't know how you would accomplish that or what that would look like, but it's a thought I had. Across from this tabletop game too, there are like these it's more tactile, physical, of famous opening lines where you're trying to guess the opening line and you can flip it over and find the answer. And then further down, there are a couple of tabletop games. One is kind of like refrigerator poetry, and you're given a random assortment of words and you're kind of playing with them. And the other one, I think there might be a couple of games on the table, and it may change based on whether you're selecting single or double player. But for me, it was like you're trying to complete this passage with the words you're given. So almost kind of like a Mad Libs, but you're trying to match it to the original text. And I had selected romance and I didn't complete it. And you're able to pick genre. And so there is a lot of interactive there. And then on the wall across, you have quotes about craft from notable authors, as well as kind of breakdowns of things like how punctuation is utilized by authors in different ways. And some of those pieces that feel smaller, but we know we're not small in terms of how things are created and crafted. So in terms of like major sections of the museum, we're moving from like historical to like readers and how readers are interacting with things, to the act of writing and creation and the craft behind things. Also at the front, they have a wall of bookmarks with like different authors on them and little screens where you can pick a specific state and look at notable authors from that state, and you can also pick up bookmarks. These are kind of directly linked to the partnerships with historical houses and museums that the Writers Museum has with these estates throughout the country. I picked up this bookmark from Jean Stratton Porter because I had to read Girl of the Limberlost in 9th grade in Indiana Lit. No matter how much of a case I tried to make that Meg Cabot should count as Indiana Lit, I did not succeed in that. One exhibit that I guess must have been temporary, and I think I knew that on some level, that was there last time and wasn't there this time, unfortunately, was a Tools of the Trade exhibit where they had been loaned notable writing instruments. I remember a lot of typewriters from significant American authors, and I think that was really cool, a way to bridge and bring the history of those writers a little bit more present and remind us, that they were operating and working with these very normal tools, even as they loom a little larger. And because writing is often so isolated and personal, it was a way to just feel a little bit more connected from behind some glass because they were very valuable pieces. But it looks like there is still a feature for this on the website, so you can see a lot of these, especially typewriters, which I think is really cool. I also went on a short Edgar Allan Poe tour that they had available for Halloween and have extended, I think, through the end of the year, but don't quote me on that. Every day at 3 o'clock. I wouldn't say go for the tour, but if you were already there, definitely take advantage of it. It was like 10 minutes. I was the only one that did it the day I was there, but I had a great conversation with the woman who took me around. They mostly just kind of take you to the spots that Poe appears in the museum, but it was interesting because I realized I don't really have a huge knowledge of Poe, working knowledge of him, especially as a creator. I didn't realize, one, that he died at 40. I think as I'm getting older, realizing how many of these people and creators that loom very large in my mind died very young it's a fact. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's a fact. I also didn't know about his personal friendship with Washington Irving, but when I was told about it, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely, that tracks. Of course they were friends. Why wouldn't they be? So yeah, I'm very grateful that this place exists and that I have such easy access to it. It's only $14 to get in. I think it's $50 a year for a membership. They have consistent programming as well, so definitely if you are in Chicago, keep your eye out for that. And if you aren't in Chicago but are going to be visiting, I think it's definitely worth a stop. It's right on Michigan Avenue. So if you are already going to be at the Art Institute earlier in the day or, at the park and you are interested, it's worth a couple hours of your time for sure. I also think, as I've said a couple times, that it is excellent for school groups. And if you have the ability to take a group, I think it would be a fun way to interact with that. But if you have been, I would love to hear your thoughts about the space, the curation, what you think about the exhibits and how they operate, and what kind of narrative you think the space is building, and whether you think it is successful or not. But thanks for going on this jaunt with me, and maybe someday soon I will figure out a more traditional vlog. But I definitely wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about this space. I think I talked about it kind of offhand many moons ago when I first started the channel. So I wanted to be able to talk about it a little bit more in depth, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again at some point. So thanks for hanging out. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it. And yeah, bye.